The air in Trattoria Bellucci was thick with the ghosts of garlic and simmering tomatoes. It was a scent older than most of its patrons. Julian Carstira sat at his usual table in the corner, a dark suit in a dimly lit room. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, his presence a weight that settled over the entire establishment. The other diners spoke in hushed tones, their laughter brittle, their gazes carefully averted. They knew who he was. Everyone knew. For 40 years, he had come to this same restaurant. For 40 years, he had ordered the same dish. Pappardelle al Cinghiale. It was not on the menu. It had not been on the menu for decades. But the kitchen always made it for him. It was an unspoken rule, a pillar of the fragile peace in his world. His two men, broad-shouldered and silent, stood by the entrance. They were not bodyguards in the traditional sense. They were extensions of his will, their stillness more menacing than any overt threat. Julian did not look at the menu placed before him. He did not need to. He simply looked at the owner, a nervous man named Antonio, who had inherited the restaurant and its obligations. The usual, Antonio. Julian's voice was low, a rumble of gravel and time. Antonio nodded, sweat beading on his upper lip. Of course, Mr. Carstira. Right away he scurried back toward the kitchen, a man fleeing a storm. Julian stared at the empty chair across from him. He always did. It was a ritual, a silent vigil. The chair was for a ghost, for a memory that tasted of wild boar and red wine. A memory of a woman named Eleonora. The restaurant was a time capsule. The checkered tablecloths were frayed. The paint on the walls was chipped. It was a place clinging to life, much like the memory itself. He kept it alive. His patronage was a form of life support. The quiet rhythm of the evening was broken. A sound at the entrance. Not a customer. Something else. One of his men, Leo, took a half step forward, his hand instinctively moving inside his jacket. Julian gave a subtle shake of his head, a barely perceptible motion. Leo froze. A young woman stood there, framed by the doorway. She was breathless, her dark hair in disarray, her eyes wide with a desperation that cut through the room's heavy atmosphere. She was young, maybe 25. She wore a simple dress and carried a worn leather satchel. She did not seem to notice the sudden, oppressive silence that had fallen. Her gaze was locked on one person. On him. She walked forward, her steps hesitant but determined. She moved past the other tables, past the shocked faces of the other diners. She was a ship sailing into the heart of a hurricane. She stopped at his table. Leo and the other man, Rico, were now poised, muscles coiled, ready to intercept. They looked to Julian for the signal. It did not come. The young woman looked down at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had her grandmother's eyes. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. It was a sensation he had not felt in 40 years. A punch from the past. He saw a ghost not in the empty chair, but in the face of the living. Eleonora's eyes. The same deep, soulful brown, filled with fire and a hint of sorrow. "Are you Mr. Carstira?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. Julian said nothing. He simply stared, caught in a temporal eddy. The years collapsed. The grey in his hair, the lines on his face, the coldness in his soul, it all felt like a costume. She took his silence as confirmation. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. She placed it on the table. It was thin, pathetic. "I need to hire you," she said. The entire restaurant held its breath. Leo started to move again, this time with more urgency. "Don't," Julian's voice was sharp. A crack of a whip. Leo stopped. Rico did not even twitch. Julian's gaze fell to the envelope. Then back to her face. To those eyes. He slowly, deliberately, reached out and slid the envelope toward him. His fingers, scarred and powerful, brushed against the cheap paper. Inside, he could feel a few folded bills. A pitiful sum. An insult, to anyone else. To him, it was a prayer. He raised a hand, a silent command for his men to remain at the door. He gestured to the empty chair. The chair he kept for Eleonora. "Sit," he said. The break in protocol was a seismic event. In Julian's world, the untouchable did not entertain the desperate. The powerful did not take meetings with the broken. And no one, ever, sat in Eleonora's chair. Tonight, someone did. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will redefine the meaning of a promise kept for a lifetime. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And in the comments below, let me know what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing where my stories reach. Now, let's get into it. Julian Castera was not a king, but he ruled a kingdom. It was a kingdom of warehouses and shipping routes, of quiet understandings and loud consequences. His word was law, his silence a verdict. He had built this empire from the ground up, using the unforgiving logic of the street. Strength respects strength. A promise made is a promise kept. And you never, ever, harm the innocent. That last rule was his own. It was a rule born not of business, but of biography. He had come to this country as a boy with nothing but dust in his pockets and a fire in his belly. He learned early that the world was divided into wolves and sheep. He chose to be a wolf, but one with a code. His ruthlessness was a tool, honed and precise. He used it to carve out a space for himself, a fortress against the chaos he had known in his youth. But inside that fortress, in a room no one else could enter, was the memory of Eleonora. They had met when they were young, both struggling, both dreaming of a life beyond the tenement blocks. She had a laugh that could shatter winter ice and a passion for cooking that was a kind of magic. She believed she could tell a person's story through food. She wanted to open a small restaurant, a place where every dish was a memory. He was already on his path, his hands learning a darker trade. She saw the good in him, the protector hidden beneath the hardened exterior. She was not afraid of his world, but she wanted no part of it. One day, Julian, she had told him, her hands covered in flour, you will have to choose what kind of man you want to be. The day he was going to ask her to marry him, he had planned a special dinner. She was going to make her signature dish for him, the one she was proudest of. Pappardelle al Singhiale. A recipe from her grandmother in the old country. It was a dish of patience and love, the meat slow-cooked for hours until it was tender enough to fall apart with a fork. He never got to ask. There was an accident. A senseless, random tragedy. A gas leak in the building next to hers. An explosion. She was gone. Just like that. The future he had imagined, the one with her laughter and her food and her light, vanished in a cloud of smoke and dust. The last thing she ever made for him was that meal. He had arrived at her apartment to find it waiting on the stove, still warm. The world had ended, but the pappardelle was perfect. He never loved again. He built his walls higher, his heart colder. But he never forgot. The restaurant her family eventually opened, Trattoria Bellucci, became his sanctuary. Ordering that dish was his way of keeping her memory alive, a 40-year conversation with a ghost. It was the one piece of his past, his softness, that he allowed to exist in the present. Now, her granddaughter sat before him, her face a heartbreaking echo of the only woman he had ever loved. The young woman, Sophia, sat stiffly on the edge of the sacred chair. She was terrified, but a fierce resolve burned in her eyes. It was the same fire he remembered. "My name is Sophia Rossi," she said. "Antonio, the owner, he is my uncle. This was my grandmother's restaurant. Eleonora Bellucci." Julian's expression did not change, but inside, a tectonic plate shifted. He had known Antonio was family, of course, but he had never made the direct connection. He had kept his distance, preserving the purity of his ritual. "I know who your grandmother was," he said, his voice softer than before. Sophia seemed surprised by this. "You do?" "I do." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The restaurant is failing, Mr. Car Steerer. My uncle, he made some bad decisions. He borrowed money from the wrong person. Julian knew this story. It was a common one in his world. Desperate people making desperate choices. A man named Silvio, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Silvio Moretti. Julian's face remained a mask, but his mind was working. Silvio Moretti. A loan shark. A bottom feeder. Not part of any real organization. A parasite who preyed on the weak, operating in the cracks and shadows that even men like Julian found distasteful. Moretti had no honor, no code. He was a cancer. He wants the property, Sophia explained, her hands twisting in her lap. The debt is too high, we can never repay it. He gave us until the end of the week. He said if we don't sign the deed over to him, he will burn it down. Burn it down. The word struck Julian like a physical blow. The irony was a cruel, twisted blade in his gut. The memory of fire and loss, the very thing that had taken Eleonora from him, was now being used as a threat against her legacy. He said it would be a shame if there was another accident, Sophia added, her voice breaking. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. My uncle is terrified. He was ready to give up. But I can't. This place, it's all I have left of her. Of my family's story. She looked around the worn-out dining room, her gaze filled with a fierce, protective love. People think it's just a building. But it's not. It's her recipes. It's her dream. It's her. Julian understood completely. He understood it more than she could possibly know. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a mausoleum of memory. It was holy ground. And Silvio Moretti was planning to desecrate it. I went to the police, Sophia said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. They took a report. They said they would look into it. They don't care. He has people on his payroll. Everyone is afraid of him. She looked him directly in the eye. But they say you are not. She gestured to the crumpled envelope on the table. I don't have much money. I cleaned out my savings. It's all there. $2,000. People say you can fix problems. Please. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. Just make him stop. Scare him. I don't know. Whatever it is you do. $2,000 to go against a violent predator. It was absurd. It was hopeless. And it was the most compelling offer Julian had received in his entire life. He looked at her, at the ghost of Eleonora in her eyes, at the impossible courage in her heart. He thought of the 40 years of lonely dinners, of the silent conversations with a memory. He had been a guardian from afar, a silent benefactor. He had been keeping the flame alive. He never imagined he would be called upon to defend it from being extinguished. This was not business. This was not about territory or money or power. This was personal. It was a debt he owed to a ghost. Julian Carsterer, the man who lived by a strict set of rules, felt them all dissolving in the face of this young woman's plea. His world was one of cold, hard transactions. You do a favor for me, I do a favor for you. Everything had a price. But this was different. He looked at the envelope. $2,000. An amount his tailor would scoff at for a single suit. To her, it was everything. It was a sacrifice. It was an act of faith. He remembered Eleonora's words, echoing across for decades. One day, Julian, you will have to choose what kind of man you want to be. For 40 years, he had been Julian Carsterer, the ruler of a dark kingdom. A man of fear and respect. He had made his choice long ago. Or so he had thought. But looking at Sophia, he realized the choice was never final. It presented itself again and again, in different forms. Today, it came in the form of a desperate girl with his lost love's eyes. Was he the man who let Eleonora's legacy burn? Or was he the man who protected it? There was no conflict. Not really. The internal debate was a mere formality, a flicker of a candle against a hurricane of certainty. His entire life, the code he had built, the power he had amassed, it had all been leading to this moment. His violent skills, his ruthless nature, were not a curse. They were a tool. And for the first time in a long time, he had a chance to use that tool for something purely good. To protect the memory that was the only sacred thing left in his life. He made his decision. He slid the crumpled envelope back across the table toward her. Sophia's face fell. She thought it was a refusal. "Please," she whispered, her voice thick with despair. "It's all I have, but I can get more. I can work, I can pay you back over time, I swear." Julian raised a hand, silencing her. "Your payment is not required," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He pushed his chair back and stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, every inch of his tall frame radiating an authority that was ancient and unshakable. He looked over at his men, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of confusion and alarm. He gave a slight nod toward the door. "Marco! Come here." The man who was not named Leo stepped forward. Marco was his lieutenant, his right hand for 20 years. A man who had seen Julian do terrible things and make impossible decisions, but who had never seen this. He had never seen his boss's glacial composure crack, not even for a second. But he saw it now. A flicker of something raw and personal in his eyes. Marco approached the table, his gaze shifting from Julian to the tear-streaked face of the young woman. "Boss?" Marco asked, his voice a low murmur. Julian did not look at him. His eyes were still on Sophia. "The pappardelle. Cancel it." Marco's eyebrows shot up. This was the true earthquake. In 20 years, Julian had never once cancelled the order. It was the unmovable center of his routine. "We have business to attend to," Julian said. He picked up a linen napkin from the table and handed it to Sophia. "Wipe your eyes. This problem of yours, it will be resolved." He turned to Marco, his voice dropping, becoming steel. "Find Silvio Moretti. I want to know where he is. Right now. And I want his file. Everything you can find. His habits, his associates, his weaknesses." "Boss, what is this?" Marco asked, his loyalty warring with his profound confusion. "This isn't our business." "Tonight, it is," Julian stated, leaving no room for argument. He started walking toward the door, his long coat swirling around him. He paused and looked back at Sophia, who was staring at him, clutching the napkin like a holy relic. "Stay here," he commanded gently. "Have dinner. Order whatever you like. Tell Antonio to put it on my account. Do not leave until I return." It was not a suggestion. It was a promise of protection. He and Marco swept out of the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of stunned diners and one young woman sitting in a sacred chair, a flicker of impossible hope dawning in her eyes. Outside, the city air was cold. "Boss, I don't understand," Marco said as they got into the back of a black sedan that had materialized at the curb. "Who is that girl?" Julian stared out the window at the blurred city lights. For a moment, he did not answer. He was looking at a ghost. "She is the granddaughter of a debt I can never repay," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of 40 years. "And Silvio Moretti is about to learn the price of disrespect." The plan was brutally simple. There would be no protracted negotiation. There would be no warning. Men like Silvio Moretti only understood one language: overwhelming force. They thrived in the gray areas, preying on those too scared to fight back. The only way to deal with a rabid dog was to put it down. Permanently. Marco worked his phone, his voice a low, efficient murmur. Within 15 minutes, he had a location. Moretti was at a grimy, smoke-filled card room above a butcher shop in the industrial district. It was his unofficial office, a place where he felt powerful, surrounded by his sycophants and enforcers. He has 2 men with him, boss, Marco reported, looking up from his phone. Amateurs. Thugs. It doesn't matter if he has the entire army, Julian said, his eyes cold. We are going in. Just the 2 of us. Marco hesitated. Boss, maybe we should take Leo and Rico. A little more muscle? No, Julian cut him off. This is not a display of power for the street. This is a personal message. It requires a personal delivery. The sedan glided through the city's dark arteries, leaving the polished world of fine dining far behind. They were heading into the city's gut, a place of rust and decay. Julian was silent, his hands resting on his knees. He looked calm, but Marco could feel the coiled energy radiating from him. It was a storm-gathering force. They pulled up a block away from the butcher shop. The street was poorly lit, littered with trash. The smell of rot hung in the air. Wait here, Julian told the driver. He and Marco got out. The night air was damp. They walked down the sidewalk, their expensive shoes making no sound on the cracked pavement. They were 2 ghosts in tailored suits, moving through a world they commanded but rarely visited in person anymore. A steel door next to the butcher shop led to a narrow, steep staircase. There was no guard. Moretti was arrogant. He believed his reputation was enough to protect him. Julian started up the stairs, Marco a step behind. The sound of loud voices and laughter grew as they ascended. At the top of the stairs was a heavy wooden door. Julian didn't knock. He simply turned the handle and pushed it open. The room went silent. Instantly. 4 men sat around a card table under a single, bare light bulb. The air was thick with cheap cigar smoke. One of them was Silvio Moretti. He was a man in his 50s, with a fleshy face, small, greedy eyes, and a garish gold chain around his neck. He was in the middle of laughing, a half-eaten cannoli in his hand. The laughter died in his throat. His 2 thugs, big men in tight-fitting shirts, scrambled to their feet, reaching for weapons tucked into their belts. They never had the chance. Marco moved with a speed that defied his size. In 2 fluid motions, he had disarmed both men, slamming their heads against the wall with sickening thuds. They collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The 4th man at the table, a skinny associate of Moretti's, froze in terror, his eyes wide as dinner plates. Leave, Julian said to him, his voice calm. The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of his chair and fled down the stairs as if the devil himself were at his heels. Now it was just Julian, Marco, and Silvio Moretti. Moretti was on his feet, his face pale, the cannoli dropped on the table. He tried to project an authority he no longer possessed. Caste era, he stammered, trying to sound indignant. What is this? You have no business here. This is my territory. Julian walked slowly toward the table. He looked down at the discarded pastry, then at Moretti, his eyes filled with a chilling contempt. You have nothing, Julian said, his voice a low growl. You are a rat feeding on scraps. You don't have territory. You have victims. He reached out and picked up the deed to the trattoria, which was lying on the table next to a pile of cash. He held it up. This is what brings me here, he said. Moretti's eyes darted between Julian and the deed. A flicker of understanding, and then fear. Pure, undiluted fear. That's just business, Moretti blustered. The old man made a bad bet. The girl, she has nothing to do with you. You are mistaken, Julian said, stepping closer until he was inches from Moretti's face. The difference between them was stark. Moretti was soft, a creature of greed. Julian was hard, a creature of will. You threatened to burn down a restaurant. Trattoria Bellucci. It's a dump. A pile of bricks. Moretti spat, trying to regain some footing. It's worth more as an empty lot. Julian's expression did not change, but a dangerous light ignited in his eyes. That pile of bricks is more important than your entire miserable life, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. You don't just see a building. You see history. You see a promise. You see a memory. He leaned in closer. 40 years ago, a woman I loved died. Her name was Eleonora Bellucci. That restaurant was her dream. The food they serve there, the very air in that room, is all that is left of her. He paused, letting the words sink in. Moretti's face had gone from pale to ashen. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had not just squeezed a failing business. He had desecrated a tomb. You threatened to burn it, Julian repeated, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. You used the very thing that took her from this world as a tool for your pathetic greed. He took the deed and, with one hand, tore it in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. The debt is cancelled, Julian announced. Moretti stared at the pieces of paper, then back at Julian, his mind racing, looking for an escape that did not exist. Castira, wait. We can make a deal. I'll walk away. I'll forget the whole thing. Just let me walk away. Julian looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw nothing worth saving. No honor. No remorse. Just a greedy little man who would do the same thing to someone else tomorrow if given the chance. You don't understand, Julian said softly. This isn't a negotiation. This is a lesson. A lesson about respect. Some things are not for sale. Some places are not to be touched. And some memories are protected. He turned to Marco. Clean this up. Marco nodded, his face grim. He understood the command. It was an order for a permanent resolution. Julian turned and walked toward the door without a backward glance. He did not need to see what happened next. The problem of Silvio Moretti was over. He would not be bothering Sofia, or anyone else, ever again. As he walked down the stairs and back into the cold night air, Julian felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not satisfaction. It was not victory. It was peace. He had kept his promise. Not one he had ever spoken, but one he had carried in his heart for 40 years. He had protected Eleonora's legacy. Tonight, he had been the man she always believed he could be. When Julian returned to the trattoria, the late-night diners were gone. The room was quiet, lit by a few dim lights. Only one table was occupied. Sofia sat where he had left her, a half-eaten plate of pasta in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and questioning. Antonio, her uncle, stood nervously by the kitchen door, wringing a towel in his hands. Julian walked to her table. He looked down at her plate. "Did you enjoy your meal?" he asked, his voice returning to its normal, calm register. She nodded slowly. "It was good. Thank you." She hesitated. Is it over?" "It is over," Julian confirmed. He placed the torn pieces of the deed on the table next to her plate. "The debt is gone. Silvio Moretti will not be bothering you or your family again." Sofia stared at the pieces of paper, then up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear. "How?" she whispered. "What did you do?" "I had a conversation with him," Julian said simply. "He came to see the error of his ways." Antonio rushed forward from the kitchen. "Mr. Castira, I don't know how to thank you. We can never repay you. Anything you want. Free meals for life. Anything." Julian looked from the grateful old man to the young woman whose world he had just saved. "There is nothing to repay," he said. He looked at Sofia. "Tonight, you gave me something worth more than money." She looked confused. "I gave you?" "I gave you nothing." "You gave me a reminder," he said, a hint of warmth creeping into his voice. "A reminder of what this place means." He gestured to the room around them. "You reminded me of a promise I made to myself a long time ago." Sofia stood up. She was no longer the terrified girl who had burst in hours earlier. She stood tall, her grandmother's strength shining through. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze searching. "People say terrible things about you," she said, her voice soft but direct. "They say you are a bad man." She paused, holding his gaze. "Are you?" It was the question he had been asking himself for 40 years. The question Eleonora had left him with. "What kind of man do you want to be?" Julian held her gaze. The answer was complex, written in shades of grey that she could never understand. But tonight, for this one night, the answer was simple. "Tonight," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for your grandmother, and for you. I got to be the good guy." A tear finally escaped and ran down Sophia's cheek. She did not wipe it away. She smiled. A real, brilliant smile that lit up her face. A smile that looked so much like Eleonora's, it made his old heart ache. "Thank you," she said. Julian gave a slight nod. He reached into his coat and took out a simple, stark white business card. It had no name, no address. Just a single phone number. He placed it on the table. "If you or your family ever need anything again, you call this number," he said. "No matter what it is. You call." He turned to leave. He had done what he came to do. The memory was safe. The ghost could rest. "Mr. Carstairs," Sophia called out, stopping him at the door. He turned back. "Next time you come," she said, her voice full of a newfound confidence, "the pappardelle will be waiting for you. I'll make it myself. The way my grandmother taught me." For the first time in decades, a genuine, small smile touched the lips of Julian Carstairs. "I look forward to it," he said. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night from which he came, leaving behind the scent of garlic, tomatoes, and a redemption 40 years in the making. 5 years passed. Trattoria Bellucci was no longer a place clinging to life. It was vibrant, thriving. Sophia had taken over the kitchen completely. She had respected the old traditions but infused them with her own youthful energy. The checkered tablecloths were now crisp and new, the walls were freshly painted, and there was a waiting list for a table on weekends. She had honored her grandmother's dream and made it her own. The restaurant was filled with laughter and life. Sophia never had to use the number on the card. The world Julian Carstairs inhabited and the world she lived in were separate once more. But she knew she was protected. The wolves that roamed the city's edges gave her street a wide berth. Her restaurant was an undeclared sanctuary, under the unseen watch of a silent guardian. Once a week, every week, Julian still came. He still sat at the same corner table. But the chair across from him was no longer just for a ghost. Sometimes, if the evening was slow, Sophia would come and sit with him after her work in the kitchen was done. She would tell him about her day, about a new dish she was trying, about a funny customer. He would listen, his quiet presence a source of steady comfort. They rarely spoke of the night he saved her restaurant. They did not need to. It was the foundation upon which their strange, gentle friendship was built. And every time he came, she would bring him his order herself. A steaming plate of pappardelle al cinghiale. It tasted of patience, of love, and of a promise kept. It tasted exactly like he remembered. One evening, Julian sat in his office. It was a stark, modern space of glass and steel, a world away from the warm clutter of the trattoria. It was the office of a powerful man, a place of cold decisions and hard realities. But on the wall, amidst charts of shipping lanes and financial reports, was a single framed photograph. It was a picture of the newly renovated Trattoria Bellucci, bustling with happy customers. In the foreground, Sophia was standing by the door, laughing, her face full of light and hope. Marco entered the office, placing a report on the desk. He saw Julian looking at the photograph. "She's done well, boss," Marco said quietly. "She has," Julian agreed, his gaze soft. He had spent his life building an empire of fear and power, a fortress of stone and silence. He was a man defined by the shadows. But in the end, his greatest legacy, the act that brought him the most profound sense of peace, was not a hostile takeover or a defeated rival. It was saving one small, unimportant restaurant. It was protecting one memory. True strength, he had come to understand, was not measured by the fear you could inspire, but by the gentleness you could afford to show. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to protect what you love, no matter the cost. And sometimes, a simple act of kindness, a promise kept across the chasm of years, can be the most powerful act of all, echoing through a lifetime and redeeming a soul that thought itself long lost.